I'm a clinical psychologist from Geelong in Australia, which is near Melbourne, and I'm interested in optimistic and uplifting ways of approaching mental health issues. And I think that much of our current models of working in the mental health area are based on an overly pessimistic and rationalistic, reductionistic way of looking at things. And so, whereas in the health field generally, we've become a lot better at understanding mind-body interactions, you don't hear much about mind, body and soul. But every culture is going to have some sense of three dimensions or a trinity in one way or another, whatever they call it. The Egyptian pyramids would have, for example, triangular faces to represent mind, body and soul. A whole range of religions will have some kind of version of a trinity. So there's a key area left out, often in mental health, including psychology. And this is an obvious problem in a number of ways. One is if we go back to the dawn of cultures, and if we look at the ways that any culture approached health issues or understanding life, and we look at shamans, every culture had its shamans or healers, and they would all have a holistic perspective, which had a strong soul dimension. But what happened, say, with psychology and in modern mental health areas, there was a concern about being objective. There was a concern about being scientific. And it was thought, well, we can understand physical things and measure them more easily. It's harder to measure the mind. And so often the mind got left out. And so with behaviorism, it was wonderful to understand about habits and human behaviour, but it gave us too limited an understanding about people. So then, say in psychology, there's a lot of emphasis on cognitive-behavioural therapy. So incorporating more of the mind. But even then it would only go so far. But there's been a real change in recent times, because if we're trying to be objective in science to get a more accurate approach of reality, then we have to allow for people's commonly observed behaviour. And after 9/11, the disaster when the planes hit the towers in New York, people were questioned about how they coped with that widespread distress. About 90% of people said that they prayed. Well, if so many people respond in that way to deal with a challenging circumstance in life that many shared, how can you ignore it? And that's where, to be more objective or more real, we have to allow not just for mind-body, but mind-body and soul. So it might seem in a bookshop like this, Watkins Bookshop, which is, I understand, is the oldest esoteric or spiritual and mystical bookshop in London. I believe it was developed initially in about 1897. I believe it moved to these premises in around about something like 1902. And so that's around the time that Carl Jung was getting going in his career. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who coined the term synchronicity about meaningful coincidence. And so one of the things that I find is that Carl Jung is a very insightful person, a lot of what he wrote about in terms of understanding people, and he looked to write about the soul or spiritual dimension in a very meaningful way based on the kind of experiences of the clients that he knew and what they described. Jung wasn't ignoring science of the day. In fact, he had conversations with Albert Einstein that partly put him onto the idea of synchronicity. When Einstein was talking about the theory of relativity, that led Jung to partly think in terms of notions of synchronicity, which we might look at meaningful coincidence that somehow connects our inner and outer worlds. Now, how does this relate more to modern psychology? One of the things is the field of positive psychology, which I'm very interested in. Positive psychology is about looking at enhancing our mental health and well-being, physical and mental health, even if you're travelling pretty well. So it's relevant to people who are struggling, but it's also relevant to people who are actually enjoying reasonably good health. How can we even further enhance our health? And we understand that one of the things objectively that helps enhance people's health is some kind of belief in a spiritual dimension in life. It's now found that if people have spiritual beliefs, they're more likely to live longer, less likely to have certain illnesses or die from certain illnesses in a certain time frame, recover better from things like cardiac conditions. People are less likely to get depressed. They're more likely to recover better from depression. And it's even found that when people have spiritual beliefs, it actually slows down cellular aging. So one way that can be measured is you can measure the length of telomeres as people, which is little caps on the end of DNA strands, and what happens when people go through major challenges like trauma or whatever, then that tends to shorten the telomeres, which is a measure of cellular aging, an objective measure. If people have spiritual beliefs, that will help buffer them from the impact of trauma. Also, we know for physical health, one thing that affects people a lot is what's called an inflammation response. And if people are affected by, say, poverty or trauma, or they're a carer for others, or a whole range of stressful circumstances, if people have suffered abuse, then what we know is people are more prone to have an inflammation response. But if people harbour certain spiritual beliefs, that has a buffering effect. Or if people engage in what we call eudaimonic well-being, which is doing things that help other people in some way, using your abilities to benefit other people, that buffers the impacts of this. Whereas if people engage in hedonic well-being or just mere pleasure, that does not have this buffering effect. So there's another way that we know that we need to look at a spiritual dimension in life, hence mind, body and soul. But some of the work I'll mention there has been done by Ken Pargament in the positive psychology field of documenting some of this research. And I describe some of that research in blogs on the website synchronicityunwrapped.com.au. But now looking at types of synchronicity. One type is number synchronicity, like seeing certain numbers over and over again. Like, do a number of people here sometimes see something like 1111 on a clock repeated a fair bit? How many of you see something like that? There's quite a number of people here and relate to that as meaningful. Well, I have a whole chapter on repeated sixes and how often they come up. And I talk about how relevant these repeated sixes are, in that I didn't plan it this way, but even though the number 6 was very relevant to me at a time when I was courting my wife, I planned to get engaged the previous day, earlier in the afternoon. We got engaged at 6 p.m. on the 6th of June. Afterwards, wow, I hadn't intended that consciously. 6 years later, went through all sorts of challenges in the hospital that I worked in. I was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. It was about 35 years ago or whatever, 30 years ago. It's 6 o'clock on the 6th of June. You don't plan that kind of thing. I was not well oriented to the time. I was severely depressed. But there was a resonance in that. So I wrote about that in the chapter. And I wrote how often when we were going out at the early stages of our relationship, we'd often be allocated the 6th room of the 6th floor in a hotel, room 66 or 606. After I wrote that chapter, the very next room that we were allocated in a 300-room hotel was room 606. The first time I presented at a conference, so an objective scientific conference on synchronicity, I was speaker number 1666. The talk here this evening would usually be given on a Thursday, but yesterday evening it was already booked for something else. Turned out, no planning whatsoever, consciously, 6 o'clock on the 6th. These little resonances often happen, and I find it affirming. Think of someone you haven't seen for years, and suddenly they get in touch with you out of the blue. Do a number of you have that experience at times? Here's someone? Okay, that's quite a common one. Okay, now, there are two examples of people, I used it first in the book, about propinquity. And one is my friend Ian from many years ago. We shared a house about 35 years ago when I was initially a skeptic, but then I read about synchronicity, had an explosion of synchronicity. Thought, wow, this is way beyond chance. Trained in statistics, this is just mind-blowing, and I think that there's really something in this. So I told my housemate, Ian, he said, this is amazing, since you talked about that. When I go to ring someone up, they ring me. So then, since mobile phones, he'd say, I'd get my finger just there to dial the number, and that person would ring me again and again and again. Now, Ian rang me 2 days ago. He said, look, you wouldn't believe it. I was in a meeting at work in Melbourne. We have this large organisation. We're going to do a project in another city. And while doing that, I mentioned this a mutual friend of ours, a guy called Mike. He said, I know this guy Mike who can help us with our economic advice and big planning kind of company. I don't understand altogether what they do. Very precise planning kind of roles. And so at that time, Mike from Wisconsin in America, when he mentions the people in the team, I know someone, Mike, who can help us with this. His phone rings at that time and it's Mike. This is 2 days ago that this happened. So when Ian says it happens all the time, it's remarkable. I mentioned one other person in that section on propinquity, a fellow named Cameron. Met him 20 years after I met Ian. And so I talked about a different example of propinquity. It turns out Cameron, who I thought was from New Zealand, and Ian, who I'd known from school days, I knew Cameron as a parent of a school or whatever, Ian was an old mate, they'd shared a house together 25 years earlier. I had no idea they had a connection. And there they are together in this little section on propinquity. Like, it's kind of spooky when you come across things like that. Like, for example, there's an expression, when the pupil is ready, the teacher will come. So around about 2003 to 2004, I became very interested in positive psychology from the very early days. Martin Seligman, very prominent psychologist who'd done theories on learned optimism, about how to be optimistic after his work on learned helplessness. So Seligman had come out with a book called Authentic Happiness. It's about how to use your strengths to get the most out of your life and experience in certain ways. Rather than clinical psychologists focusing on problems like anxiety and depression, let's focus on the best in people and look at people's strengths. And I thought that some of the way that Seligman described this was remarkably astute and worthwhile, and I thought they're going to still be talking about this positive psychology and authentic happiness. They'll talk about that still in 100 years. Not much I've experienced in as 40 years as a psychotherapist that I think that they'll still be talking about in 100 years. Anyway, what had happened is I've been working for 25 years in Geelong. I thought, how am I going to mark this occasion, the 25th anniversary? I want to mark it in some way. I thought, I'll do a 1 hour public lecture. And I'll sum up in 1 hour the most useful things I've learned from 25 years practicing as a psychotherapist, as a clinical psychologist. I'll spend 10 minutes talking about Carl Jung and synchronicity. I'll spend 20 minutes talking about Martin Seligman and positive psychology. The next year, I learnt that Seligman and his team from Philadelphia were coming to work and live in Geelong. Seligman himself to live in Geelong for 6 months to start the world's largest organisation-wide project in positive psychology. They chose Geelong Grammar, where they introduced positive psychology into education. And they chose that because if it was successful there, then it was likely to be picked up everywhere, because Geelong Grammar was famous because of Prince Charles going there. And at the time, Seligman did not want to do this in North America, where most American professors would have. And he was a president of the American Psychiatric Association, rare to do anything outside America. But it was around the time of the Iraq War, and Seligman thought too much negative energy in America to do it here. Best to do it in far off Australia, this little obscure place called Geelong. It was obscure as unlikely as Paul McCartney going there to teach music. So there, I've talked about Seligman. Then the next year I could talk about the same, repeat the talk about Jung and synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, and mention again Seligman and say, oh, by the way, Seligman's actually coming here to live next year. I think that's synchronicity. So these things happen, and sometimes people think, oh, you're looking into this, or you're a bit superstitious, or well, some things just whack you over the head so much. I think you'd have to be gullible to think that that's just random chance, this kind of thing happening. If you're going to be a little objective about it, you think, that's pretty unlikely. And so when I think of synchronicity, I think it's a good example of what Ken Pargerman talks about as sacred experience. So if people, again, believe in a spiritual dimension in life, if we sanctify our roles, like you see yourself as having a calling, it's got a spiritual element to it. you're more likely to be engaged in what you do and persist with it and deal with conflict better. Or if you see your relationship as sanctified, so say your marriage is meant to be, you deal with conflict better, you manage with stress in your relationship better. These things are a demonstrable kind of thing. So I think of synchronicity as sacred moments that have a numinous quality to them. And the more improbable, the more numinous the feeling. And we know now from research from people like Ernest Rossi, a clinical psychologist who's got physicists and chemists on his team, that when people respond to numinous experience, then that leads to neuroplasticity. It creates new brain connections. So in 90 minutes we can form a new synapse. If you experience some real novelty, something that really grabs your attention, like numinous experience, within seconds it switches on genes that create proteins to start to create new synapses that are fully formed in 90 minutes. So if something really moves you, it'll tend to start to lead to neurons and synapses connecting down this neural pathway rather than another neural pathway. So we know we can reprogram ourselves. And if we do that based on some of this uplifting kind of experience, which also gives this motivating dopamine kind of hit, then that can help us be engaged in our roles and things that we do. So when I learnt that Seligman was coming to Geelong, I thought, well, to have the opportunity to meet with him and his entourage and his team, I was fortunate to befriend a fellow called Trent Barry, who largely masterminded that group coming to Geelong. You would meet with these world leaders at barbecue or in informal situations and really get to know this field that I thought was so promising and see it build from the ground up. It was such a fortuitous thing. So it's as much as anything the synchronicity of this that led me to think, I will commit my future career largely to looking at positive psychology, but looking to bring more of that like Jungian transpersonal dimension into it that I think was it tended to be ignored a bit up until that time. Different kinds of synchronicity, different kinds of synchronicity in terms of very uncanny and meaningful experience. One example is when I started to write the second edition, in about January this year, several people got in touch with me on the one day. Ian was one of them who had another story about propinquity. But this fellow wrote to me and he said, look, I know you're interested in synchronicity. I've read something of your book. I want to tell you this story about a psychic monk. He said, look, many years ago when I was a school teacher, he was now retired, he said, maybe mid-30s, one day I woke up and I suddenly had a speed reading ability that I didn't have the day before. That was weird enough. But he used to go to this place called the Tarrawarra Abbey in the beautiful Yarra Valley near Melbourne. And he would read history and spiritual and philosophy books and mystical kind of books using this speed reading ability. One day he's driving there with a mate of his. And it was around Melbourne Cup time, the horse race. So as they're filling in the time, driving, he says, he says to his mate, look, I've heard that there's a psychic monk at the Tarrawarra winery. And then his friend says, well, how would you know that a monk's psychic? He said, well, look, I suppose if we saw him riding on a little wooden rocking horse, the top just came out of the top of his head. They get there, the evening, knock on the door. Which of the 25 monks opens the door? The so-called psychic monk. They go, and they used to be a Trappist order, so not very talkative, these characters. He's been reading a book by the fire, went to sit down on his chair, and these two, Neil and his mate, sat on either side of him, and he was saying nothing, the monk, for a couple of minutes. Uncomfortable. So Neil sort of thought, I'll break the silence. First question that came into his mind, just popped in his mind. And he says to the monk, how would you describe the nature of God? And the monk said, well, actually the monk said nothing. The monk just sat on his chair. After a little while, he started imperceptibly moving a bit back and forth on his chair. After a while, he's moving further back and forth on his chair. Then he gets out an imaginary whip and starts going like this, like a jockey on a horse. There's these wooden little chairs moving back and forth. And he said, look, it's like this. God is like a rider on a horse. And often God has to rein people in a bit, but there's some people who can let the reins loosen. I think this is just remarkable because Freud used the notion of a rider on a horse to represent the psyche. The rider is the ego. The horse is the id, the animal kind of spirits and energy. And the, like the reins kind of thing is like the conscience. So this is interesting because a psychic monk is like the notion of, so God, if you like, the story of what God is like, is like the rider on the horse. But there's this notion of a psychic monk kind of thing, which made it kind of interesting. And I sort of thought, there's something really in this. And so afterwards I was looking up different kind of references on the web. People sometimes talk of a library angel where you pull a book out and open up any page and you just see the most relevant thing to you. Do some of you have that experience? Yeah. Pull a book off these shelves and that's just amazing. It's just what I'm after, right? So that happens with the web as well. And after a while, for different reasons, I'd heard about Plato and Phaedrus. I thought, there's something in Phaedrus, because Phaedrus is a character mentioned in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is my favourite philosophy book. I thought, I've got to find out more about Phaedrus and Plato. And Plato referred to the soul as the rider on a winged chariot. Well, this is fascinating. The psyche is like a rider on a horse. The soul is like a rider on a winged horse. This is interesting because when you bring the soul, the transcendent dimension, a transpersonal element into psychotherapy, there are many stories in my book on this. I think that you end up with therapy with wings. There are dramatic turnarounds that people can go through if they have a numinous experience. For example, they're in the throes of an attempt to take their life, and the most amazing coincidence happens that thwarts their attempt, and then they think, wait a minute, I'm meant to live. Turn their lives around, and I've given examples of that in the book. And when you see this as a therapist, it's very compelling. So there's an example of an uncanny kind of coincidence, but like Jung talked about, there can be meaning in the coincidence, so you look to unwrap the gift. If you just leave it uninterpreted, it doesn't mean so much. But I think, okay, this is ticks from the universe. I think synchronicity is often affirming, tick from the universe to keep on going with this interest. Now, this is the theory of how I think it tends to work in relation to mental health. So this is a more sort of usual psychological way that I would describe it. Synchronicity helps for a sense of connection through propinquity. Right? It's good for your mental health to feel more connected to people. It works through a sense of affirmation. So the sense of affirmation of feeling I'm on the right track. Many people experience synchronicity as affirming something like ticks from the universe, you're on the right track. Would a number of people relate to that idea?
Yeah.
It's often, and then that also leads to the sense of a higher organising force in the universe, often benevolent. And with that ties in with the notion of spirituality, which we know is good for your mental health. Then also, to interpret the synchronicity, it's good for using your intuition rather than just rationalistic thinking. So that's also using our right brain as well as our left brain, so to speak. We don't neglect our logic, but we add our further intuition. Now these are demonstrably helpful for our mental health. They also relate to the standard model in positive psychology, which is anything that enhances your PERMA, P-E-R-M-A, is good for your mental health, happiness and well-being. P, positive affect or emotion. We experience synchronicity, amazing coincidences, can lead to awe, wonder, happiness, quirky, fun kind of thing. So positive affect. I'll do the R now, relationships, connection. Feeling more connected, like Ian says, this thing with the phone makes me feel more connected with people. Good for relationships. Then the other things I mentioned, like say with Seligman coming to Geelong, that sense of purpose, engagement in what you're doing, it helps the E, M&A, E, engagement in your life roles and tasks. M, sense of meaning or personal meaning in life, and A, sense of your accomplishment. If you're kind of motivated by feeling that things are meant to be, you're feeling that you're supported by some higher organising force, you're getting these hits of dopamine along the way, you're more likely to be engaged, have a sense of meaning and accomplish more. And so that's why I find it's a really easy subject to write about synchronicity in terms of that uplifting feeling. I've written a lot about trauma in the past. It's not as much fun to write about. It's interesting, it's intriguing, and it can be very helpful to people, but synchronicity is another thing again. It can be quirky. I refer to the cosmic prankster. So I call this, my son Rowan here, who helps us with our digital media at our practice in Geelong. We have a psychology practice with 10, 12 psychologists, and Rowan does the digital media for that. So he's been over here with us, and I call this the Optimistic Monk book tour. Because we were there at Oxford looking around and, you know, catching up with a couple of Rowan's friends. So I thought, oh, look, great, we'll watch the soccer. I think it was Arsenal and Tottenham, and we can have a beer when we're there. People at the bar, about 10 taps, love the old English ales. You don't get in Australia like that. And there's only one I can sort of peer and see the tap. Think, oh, what do they have here? Peer through, and it's called the Optimistic Monk. That's pretty good. I'm here to look at combining the notion of spirituality, positive psychology, the spiritual dimension, optimistic monk. What better? But also, like, you can have beers every now and then. That's fine. Enjoy Australia. Enjoy a beer. Optimistic monk. Kind of silly in a way, but to me the meaning is, if you look to unwrap it, there we are at Oxford, a seat of learning, lots of objectivity and science. There's a message tailored for me. So it says, look, you belong here. But also, you can have a beer while you do it. You don't have to be altogether serious in being an author or take it all too seriously or whatever kind of thing. You can have a bit of fun with this, because that's how life works as well. So don't get too serious about all this. Have a bit of fun. It's the Optimistic Monk book tour. Something very important, which was when I looked up Phaedrus, he talks about the difference between common madness and divine madness. Common madness is like mania. And Plato says there's a difference between mania and divine madness, which has 4 different types. There is creativity. There's mystical rites, like religious rites. Then there is art and science, the muses. And then there's prospection, prophecy. Now, one thing that strikes me is synchronicity sometimes gives you the sense that something's going to happen, and it's striking how often it does. There's prophecy. Plato talked about this years ago. Seligman now talks in the positive psychology field that prospection is such a central thing about human beings, we should be called Homo prospectus. If we're going to talk about the importance of prospection for humans, anticipating the future, why not allow for uncanny prospection? Why not allow for prospection with wings? So I think the thing is not to be so afraid, for psychologists and others, not to be so afraid of this mystical dimension. You aren't here because you're at Watkins Bookshop. You're familiar with this and more easy with this, but many people are a little bit fearful of this. And part of why I wanted to write my book too is a number of people do get fearful when they have experiences. They think, this is just too weird, it's doing my head in. Now what does this mean? 2 main mistakes that you can make at that point. One is to ignore it and just push it away because it's just too freaky, because that then limits us, I think, as people. It takes out the uncanny and the numinous, which we know can be worthwhile. But the other thing is to get carried away with what's called psychic inflation. Think, oh, I'm special. I've got this really turbocharged power. And there are times I thought and reacted a bit like that, because there weren't other people saying, oh, this is all over the place. More than 50% of people in all the continents surveyed believe in some kind of paranormal phenomena, and synchronicity is the most commonly recognised form. About 40% of people. Let's talk about it and say this is normal. And so it's a bit like from the age of enlightenment, when there's all this emphasis on logic and reason, being overly emphasising logic and reason is what stops people from being enlightened, in the sense of the uncanny, the mystical or whatever. We've taken the rational side too far. And Jung, all those years ago, he lamented that people were becoming too rationalistic. It's from about this 70, nearly 100 years ago, too focused on the rational. And he said that what we need is for people to individuate, meaning we need to become more fully ourselves. And to do that, we need to turn within, not just go by other people's ideas for us. So Jung said to sort out the problems of the day, like 70 years ago or whatever, he says more people need to individuate. Well, I think those issues of we really need people to address the problems of the day-to-day by really being most fully ourselves and drawing on these, dare I say, mystical, transpersonal, uncanny kind of abilities. So some people say that with the problems that we've got in the world today of pollution or inequality or climate change or whatever, they say what we need is a cavalry. I reckon what we need is a cavalry with wings. Let's not forget the transpersonal, let's not forget the transcendent, because when I think of the clients I've seen over the last 40 years, some of the most striking signs of change, including in a therapy setting, have been when people have had numerous experience. Sometimes it's hit them over the head, sometimes it's developed more gradually, but that is what can move people like nothing else and lead to powerful, what we call paradigm change, going through the hero's journey. Where you're going along, something tips the balance. The dark night of the soul. Then something can shift things in a striking way and then consolidate the change. So the most powerful change that I see is mediated by experiences that are out of the ordinary, but not so out of the ordinary as we would make out.
I've got two problems. One, I'm completely atheistic.
Yes.
I'm not in the least bit spiritual.
Yes.
That said, I've certainly had some wacky experiences
Yes.
of coincidences.
Yes.
And the problem is I don't bother to try and make sense of it all.
Yes.
That's the problem. I've got to say I like Jungian people,
Yes.
but the Jungian ideas, I'm not
Yes.
so sure about.
Yes.
I like Freudian ideas, but
Yes.
I don't like Freudian people.
Okay. Now,
That's my problem.
if I can mention briefly with that, well, first of all, I don't know if it's a problem. Like, for me, I'm going to think of looking at ways of explaining things because I'm sort of like a psychologist and look at community education, and it's part of my role and part of my bent. But sometimes people say, like I think Freud might have said, why try and interpret a dream? The message in the dream is the message. It's as good as it is. And I think there's some truth in that. That overlaps with Jungian psychology, but I'm wary of notions of looking at Jungian psychology or Freudian psychology or whatever, because my conception of Freudian or Jungian or whatever can be a little bit distorted as well. So I go with what works. I'm not religious myself. I'm one of the 25 to 30% of people in Western cultures who identify as being spiritual rather than religious. And I think that that's a group of people who often will respond to the notion of uncanny coincidences being meaningful. Is it Umberto Seggiuli, is it?
Yeah, the father of psychosynthesis.
Look, this is terrible. I don't even know about him, and I will look him up. There you go. That's how you learn with something like this. And I think transpersonal psychology is just a really worthwhile field. So much so that I turned up for a meeting, the first meeting of in the last couple of years with the people who are members of the Transpersonal Psychology group in Australia. It was held in Melbourne. 3 people turned up. How weird is that? Just 3 people. Wasn't a terrible weather day or something like that? So I think that there needs to be much more acknowledgement of transpersonal psychology. In terms of Stanislav Grof, I think he said lots of really interesting things. I haven't studied him very well, and but I no doubt that there's a lot of learned understanding as well as controversial elements of, I suppose, his explorations with drugs and things like that. But I think that there'd be a lot of also scholarship that influenced him. Yes, the notion of spiritual emergency, and people get caught up in drugs and other things if they're when they're really maybe yearning for more of that spiritual connection. I write a bit about that in my book in terms of the notion of psychosis versus satori. When I went through a remarkable experience of synchronicity about 15 years ago around the time my mother died, to me it was an enlightenment experience, satori. Several people close to me, not all, thought I was psychotic. And so even though I thought there's a lot of objective indicators that what I was doing was very effective, and 15 years later I'd say that was demonstrated. But I think that's where it's important for people to learn to differentiate the difference between psychosis and satori. To do that, look for Plato. So William Blake, was he nuts? Look how much influence he had over the Rolling Stones, Beatles, hippies, the Beat Poets or whatever. Your informal national anthem, Jerusalem, had so much impact. I'd say there's a bit of divine madness there. Don't just dismiss him because he had visions. And so I think, like Allen Ginsberg had visions of William Blake. Does that mean that Allen Ginsberg was psychotic? It's too quick to dismiss what doesn't seem rational. So I think that often people come with very creative ideas at the border of chaos and order. And after all, isn't that a lot of what Harry Potter's about? Delightful in the apartment we have in London. We look out the window and there's Harry Potter, the School of Magic. And it's a reminder. And why does that resonate with people so much? I think we can often be most creative when we look at being at the border of chaos and order. So order, all the learned knowledge and all the rest of it. But chaos, being prepared to be bold, being prepared to be a couple of steps beyond what might be most conventional or whatever. I think that's where a lot of creativity arises. That's why I must admit I enjoy living and working in a place like Geelong, 1 hour from Melbourne. Melbourne gives the order, closely connected to people in the mainstream field, but you're a little bit enough out of it that you don't have as many people telling you, no, you shouldn't do that, that's too wacky. If I worked and lived in Melbourne, I don't think I could have readily written a book about synchronicity.